Hey guys, welcome back. This is part two of Imperialism in East Asia, and now we're looking at Japan. So please turn your books to page 377. Um, Now, observe this feudal map of Japan before the Sekigahara period. So we're looking at four different colors, right? You've got the blues, the yellows, the reds, and the blacks. Reds being the areas with the widest coverage, followed by the yellows, the blues, and then the blacks. These areas, these colors represent a different shogunate. So the reds were under the Tokugawa, and then the yellows were under the Ishidas, and then the blues are the neutrals, and the blacks were the deserters, meaning they were not part of any shogun or any shogunate. Um, So just by observing the geography and the layout of the map, we can pretty much say that this was not a very peaceful time in Japan because this seems to be very fragmented. It looks like a puzzle piece. Japan was not united during this time, and one can imagine shogun versus shogun, daimyo versus daimyo, samurai versus samurai. Um, the people, pretty much, you can say, were missing having an emperor or having a peaceful time or having just simply peace in Japan. And this sentiment ended up spreading all throughout Japan. So, if we take a look, by the 1800s, Japan was still ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, and these local lords they had a lot of power. So that system was fragmented, and it made it difficult to face outside threats. So if you recall, sometime in the 17th century, around 1636, Japan was in an age of seclusion, or they had an active seclusion called the Sakoku period, wherein they were mandated to isolate themselves from all foreign influences, except for the Dutch, which were allowed to have a small trade outpost in Nagasaki. Um, But for about 200 years, they did not allow Westerners to step foot in Japan. Just until the mid 1800s, when trade with Europe um, was an increasingly growing idea. And so by 1853, here comes Commodore Matthew C. Perry from the US, from the United States, sending a fleet of steam powered warships going to Japan. So if you can just imagine all these warships heading towards a country demanding to open its ports to trade, of course you open your ports to trade, otherwise it would be war. But this sight of the ships made Japan curious. It made them want to become something else. And so the government ended up allowing Europeans and the Americans to trade and take advantage of the new industrial knowledge that came with the trade. So, what happened was the Tokugawa shogunate ended up weakening, which led to civil wars, and eventually they were overthrown in 1868. And then, because it had to be changed, their response to the Western intrusion, where the Japanese lords ended up launching what was called the Meiji Restoration, which was led by a very intelligent teenage boy who was 15 years old at that time, named Mutsuhito. And Mutsuhito had remarkable ideas, wherein the Meiji oligarchs had to change their institutions and their society in order to transform the country into a world-class industrialized and military power. That was the goal of the Meiji Restoration. So if you look here, you have these women who probably used to wear traditional Japanese clothing, now are wearing European fashion. So the government encouraged and funded all advancements in industry and military, technology, science, engineering, education, and even in fashion, because they wanted that change that badly. All right, so if you take a look at your book, this was all listed in page 379. So there were changes in politics, in society, economy, military forces, and education. And there's a very tiny image there of Mutsuhito. Okay, now let's take a look at Japanese imperialism. As they learned, as they educated themselves, they ended up becoming a very industrialized, modern, um, modern technologically and developed nation. And they ended up becoming or having an authoritarian or monarchy. And so, with this belief in themselves, they ended up expanding their sphere of influence towards the West. So they looked into Korea, they looked into Manchuria, and they looked at parts of China. And so in your book, let's take a look. You end up in page 379 and 380. Japan goes through three different events. So in 1894, Japan goes to war and then defeats China. And then they ended up having a treaty called the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which paved the way for Japan to stake its claim over Formosa or Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula from China. And this treaty opened its ports to Japan, ending up with Japan being one of the most favored nations of China, aside from Britain, which is very interesting because here's another Asian country extending its force towards another Asian country. All right. And then in 1905, Japan fights with Russia and wins. So this is the Russo-Japanese War. So if you look at page 381, this war was over a territory, over a port. So if you look at that map in your book on page 381, there's Port Arthur right there. It was a war based on that. They wanted to, I think Russia had a naval base there, and Japan needed that area, all right, to dominate Korea. And so they did. And so they win, they fight Russia and they win. And after a while, in 1910, they ended up annexing Korea. Annex is a connection, a stepping stone. So in order to get to an area, you need to step to cross it. And Korea was the crossing, was the path towards China. So here are three different events, and Japan ends up becoming the victor. So if you look at this political cartoon, it says here to Manchuria. And here's Korea. And it says, I hereby grant you a permit to traverse Korean territory. And on top, as if to say, so obliging. Very interesting. Okay, so let's take a look. So if we were to compare and contrast Japan and China, both countries limited Western trade at first, or any Western influence whatsoever. China, their attitude towards Western influence, it was that they were resistant to it. They were resistant to change or resistant to influence, which ended up weakening the nation. With Japan, they accepted the influence, and then eventually it transformed itself into a major industrialized and military power. Now, both countries were negatively affected by Western and American powers and the age of industrialization, and were asked to sign unfair treaties. But with China, they rejected railways and technology and ended up slowing down foreign intrusion at first, but it also denied them of the best means of defense against foreign pressure. Whereas with Japan, they embraced technology and industry, therefore, they were able to modernize and become a world power themselves. And they ended up having something called the sphere of influence over China. And so both countries had similar conditions, imperialism, but they responded to them differently. So, it's a very interesting thing. Okay, so this is the two leaders that led to those events. One that leads to the downfall of China, and one that leads to its development and advancement. So this is the Empress Dowager Cixi, or the Dowager Empress Cixi, and this is Emperor Mutsuhito of Japan. All right. So, what was the difference in the leadership and governance of China and Japan, and their attitudes towards imperialism? Um, Both led differently. I think if you were to ask me, she was very reactive, whereas he was very proactive in terms of making a change. They both wanted something good for their own countries, but one was more successful. All right. So I think it also boils down to attitude. And one saw an opportunity, the other one saw a threat. And that's how you look at things in life, right? So whenever you make a decision, it's either you see it as an opportunity or you see it as a threat. And then you make a decision on how you respond to that threat or opportunity. All right, so going back to our essential question, I'd like you to write your responses in the comment section below. How was China imperialized and how did Japan grow into an imperial state? If your response is too long, feel free to message me on Edmodo. I will check your responses. There, I think that's all for today. Thanks so much for watching. Bye, guys.